Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online program, Anthropologist in the Archives, Writing the Life of Marie Potts. We're going to be getting started in just a few moments. We're letting in participants from the waiting room right now. So just sit back and relax. We appreciate your patience. Again, we will be starting shortly. Thanks. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online program for Monday, March 29th. It's titled Anthropologist in the Archives, Writing the Life of Marie Potts. It's just about 2 minutes after 5 o'clock, and we will be getting started shortly. There's some folks entering from the waiting room right now, so sit back, relax. Again, we will be starting in a minute or so. We appreciate your patience. Thanks. Good evening, everyone. It's now about 3 minutes after 5 o'clock, and I think we're gonna get started. We can let the other individuals join from the waiting room while we're in progress. So good evening, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online program, Anthropologist in the Archives, Writing the Life of Marie Potts. It's a live online presentation by Terri Castaneda. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the Executive Director of the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and host this webinar. Tonight we have more than 150 people registered for this presentation, so for those of you who are new to us, the Book Club of California is a nonprofit, member and donor supported organization dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes we do that with a focus on the literature and history of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition books, a scholarly journal, and keepsakes. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, history, and much, much more. If you're not a member, or if your membership has lapsed, and you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Our membership dues are modest, but the benefits are many. We simply cannot do the work that we do without the support of our members. So I encourage you to visit our website at bccbooks.org to join or donate to the book club. And now for tonight's program and our presenter. The program, Anthropologist in the Archives, Writing the Life of Marie Potts. It's a live online presentation by Terri Castaneda. Terri Castaneda is a professor of anthropology at California State University, Sacramento, where she also serves as faculty curator for the Anthropology Museum. Prior to moving to California in 1994, she was a curator at the Houston Museum of Natural Science. She earned her PhD at Rice University in Houston, Texas in 1993, and her BA at Texas A&M University. She is the author of journal and book articles and a curator of exhibits, including The Lettered Life of a Mountain Maidu Woman, an archival portrait of Marie Mason Potts at the Maidu Museum and Historic Site in Roseville, California. She is the author of Marie Mason Potts, The Lettered Life of a California Indian Activist, published by the University of Oklahoma Press this past fall, 2020. Born in the northern region of the Sierra Nevada mountains, the subject of tonight's talk, Marie Mason Potts, 1895 to 1978, was a Mountain Maidu woman who became one of the most influential California Indian activists of her generation. Potts was not only an activist, she was a California Indian newspaper editor and publisher based in Sacramento, California, who, for the last 3 decades of her life, left a trail of biographical breadcrumbs that stretches from her ancestral homelands in the High Sierra to the halls of Congress. Tonight, Terri Castaneda will discuss the process of pursuing the traces of Potts' life over the course of more than a decade, bringing to the fore the many contexts of which Potts' written work, from off-reservation boarding school essays to columns in The Smoke Signal of the Federated Indians of California, to her own book, The Northern Maidu, stand as a testament to her pioneering work as a California Native activist. Tonight, she will draw connections between her research and the insights to be gained from inhabiting the archives as an ethnographic field site. So if you have any questions for our presenter, please use the chat and the Q&A function in Zoom. We should have some time at the end of the hour to take questions, and we'll curate those questions from the Q&A. And now, it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Terri Castaneda, and pass over the controls for tonight's webinar. Terri, it's all yours.
Thank you, Kevin. I want to thank the Book Club of California for inviting me to give this talk. And second, I want to note that I am coming to you from Carmichael, California, outside of Sacramento, now actually considered a suburb of Sacramento, which is the traditional homelands of the Nisenan people. Marie Potts was born in 1895 when boarding schools and forced assimilation were core features of federal Indian policy. And since the first part of my talk focuses on Marie's boarding school years, I wanted to point out that the 2 institutions that she attended. The Carlisle Indian Industrial School is way over here in Pennsylvania. It was founded in 1879. But the other one is number 11 on this map. And it is over here in her traditional homelands, the heart of Mountain Maidu country in present-day Plumas County. And it was a mere 15 miles from her home, as the crow flies. So the Mission Indian School was established in 1890 as a day school, but eventually began to board pupils. And some of the students who lived nearby continued on as day students. But in 1897, the federal government began the process of purchasing the school and taking over its supervision. And I wanted to point out in this picture this man sitting on the steps. His name is Edward Ament. He was the superintendent, and his wife, Floy, F-L-O-Y, it's an odd name, but those were the people who ran the school in the very early days when Marie was there, and I will come back to them. Let's see. So the Mission Indian School was established through the patronage of Amelia Quinton, president of a Christian reform organization called the Women's National Indian Association. And there are substantial records from the school held in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., but the greater part are in the Pacific Regional Branch in San Bruno. And these records deal for the most part with administrative matters, budgets, personnel, student enrollments and conduct, correspondence between parents and school administrators, academic and vocational curricula and the like. And they're very critical, of course, to the story that I tell about the school. But it was this publication, The Indian's Friend, that enabled me to recover Marie's voice at barely 5 years old and to develop a more ethnographic portrait of life at the Greenville Indian Industrial School, which continued to figure into the pages of The Indian's Friend long after the government took it over. And I was fortunate because my university had microfilm for all of this. So I spent hours and hours on my own campus in this instance, reading this really revealing publication. So Marie arrived at the Greenville Indian School in June 1900 when she was just 4 years old. Several years before this group portrait was taken. And although she had siblings and cousins already there, the transition was traumatic as it entailed much more than leaving her family's camp about 15 miles away and her beloved Huckespin, her grandfather. And here I want to read a passage from the book. Marie's carefree life with Huckespin and Mariah wound to an abrupt close in June 1900. In February, the Office of Indian Affairs budgeted $150 for student recruitment and transportation. The government wanted beds filled. The Ammons, that's the husband and wife team I pointed out, often found the commissioner's expectations tedious and absurd, but they were dedicated to the school's Christian mission, and on occasion, this aligned with his demands. For a decade, Floyd had ministered to the sick, checked on elderly Maidu, and distributed medicine, clothing, and toys sent by the barrelful from WNIA affiliates. She was a familiar presence in Big Meadow, where between late spring and early summer, she made 3 trips to visit camps and collect students. Recent acquisition of a covered wagon made these excursions decidedly more comfortable and efficient. Perhaps Marie was more curious than scared on the road to Greenville, but this quickly changed. Boarding pupils were bathed upon entry, and in some schools subjected to haircuts and destruction of tribal clothing. She was not going to escape this ritual. Marie surveyed her strange surroundings while Floyd stripped her down. Spotting a tub of steamy water, she was terrified to find herself suddenly inhabiting it. Unable to speak or understand English, she drew on experience. Knowing that her grandmother Mariah used big tubs to cook acorn mush, Marie ascertained that she had been plucked of her clothes for this very same purpose. Bolting out of the tub, she sprinted naked and frightened into the countryside as far as her little legs would carry her, 2 or more miles, she later recalled. Woefully, her escape was thwarted when an older pupil caught up to her on a bicycle. For the next 12 years, minus a few summer weeks here and there, and 2 years in public school, Greenville was home, not because she boarded there for so long that she forgot her grandparents' camp or her mother's existence, but rather because it became an important site of family practice and belonging. The pupil who came after her was her 14-year-old cousin, Eli Piazzoni, the eldest pupil in the Bill lineage, her grandfather's lineage. Marie was the youngest. Eli's rescue of Marie was simultaneously an act of betrayal and an expression of love, a poignant testament to the condition of being colonized as a people and determined to exercise the protective ties of family and kinship that boarding schools sought to undermine. Bundling his naked little cousin in his shirt, he pedaled back to Floyd in the waiting bath, assuring Marie in their shared Maidu language that she was not going to be cooked alive. Because of the school's proximity to her home, Marie never suffered a complete cultural rupture, and by all accounts, she excelled in and even enjoyed some of her academic studies. The formal curriculum ended with 7th grade, but Marie stayed on an additional year. By this time, she was friends with Selena Two Guns, a Seneca woman and recent graduate of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, who had recently been hired as the small boys matron, which means that it was her job to play a surrogate mother role to the young male pupils, the pre-adolescent boys. And you can see these two images show the gender segregation of the school. But you can see Marie here in the back row. She is probably around 16 here. And this is Selena Two Guns standing in front of her. Two Guns urged Marie to follow in her footsteps and matriculate at Carlisle, although Potts needed little encouragement in this direction. As I explain in the book, she was already drawn to the school for other reasons. But Two Guns provided a role model and a vision of a future that didn't entail working as a domestic laborer for the white settlers who had taken over her land. And this was the lot of nearly all of Marie's female kin. At 17 years old, Marie completed her own application to Carlisle and worked for the summer of 1912 to pay for her own train fare out to Carlisle. On September 12th, 1912, Marie embarked on an adventure that would change her life, boarding the Western Pacific for the trip to Pennsylvania. Fortunately, she had the companionship of Two Guns, who decided after a year at Greenville that mountain living just wasn't for her. The Western Pacific had recently opened a new series of stations that ran through Potts' homeland, which was rapidly becoming popular with Bay Area residents in pursuit of recreational tourism. And this series of stops is right here in this squared off location. Marie boarded the train at Keddie, one of these new stops, and continued on toward Philadelphia. Though she had grown up mere hours from the coast, the first time Marie laid eyes on an ocean, it was the Atlantic and not the Pacific. The cross-country travelers arrived in Philadelphia on September 15th, where they changed trains for a final leg to the school. After escorting Potts to Carlisle, Two Guns traveled back to Philadelphia and then on to her own reservation up in Western New York. So the Carlisle campus for Marie must have been really intimidating because it was huge by comparison to this much smaller rural school with a clapboard schoolhouse in the High Sierra. And I wanted to point out, I can get my cursor to work, this bandstand, because we will come back to it in a bit. But you can see that it was definitely a park-like campus by comparison to Marie's Greenville experience. Her arrival is documented somewhat unceremoniously in this hand-labeled ledger at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. The consecutive record of pupils enrolled, and this is actually a continuation of earlier enrollment statistics and numbers, and in fact, this is female students only. We can see her here, number 2767, Marie Mason Digger, arriving September 15th, 1912. Marie's application to Carlisle, which she filled out herself, is lost to history, at least for now. I'm still hopeful that it'll turn up somewhere. But these cards do offer some critical information. We can see her age, her religious training over here in the corner of this one, which was Methodist. That aligns with the Greenville mission's Protestant versus Catholic orientation. And the Carlisle had both of these kinds of services for students. They also record over here on the left hand side, they record her what are called outing destinations. Outing was an element of Carlisle's Americanizing curriculum and entailed going to so-called country homes to live with and work for white families. By Marie's time, they were expected to spend a whole year on outing. And it was members of the Quaker community in Philadelphia and the surrounding states who were the principal beneficiaries and hosts, but also the beneficiaries of student labor. So Marie's first outing experience began after her first year at Carlisle. It started in the summer of 1913 in May when she went on outing to the Fred Rapp family who lived in a Philadelphia suburb. But this was just a quick stopover because not long after she arrived, the family packed up and moved to their summer cottage in Ocean City. And it was here that Marie got her first taste of the beach, and she never forgot its pleasures. She talked about it late in life. And then in late August, she returns for only about a month before she heads back out again to New Jersey yet again, to a long-time and elderly woman named Rebecca Love. She went by Ari Love. And while she's there, she goes to public school and she advances by method of exam, which is why she chose this outing destination. She advances 2 grade levels, returning to Carlisle at the close of August 1914, just in time for her senior year, which is really the equivalent of 10th grade. So some of Marie's outing experiences are documented in the Carlisle Arrow, the student newspaper famously produced on site as part of a vocational curriculum designed to place male pupils in jobs as printers. And Marie, we can see, was clearly a very gregarious young woman who threw parties, and she kept company with new and old friends from a wide array of tribal nations, about whom she was learning, by the way, both in and out of the classroom. And the Arrow also documents her membership in the YWCA. In fact, she was its president in her senior year. And this was not the only extracurricular activity in which she engaged. Potts honed her literary and debating skills in the Susan Longstreth Literary Society, or the Susans, named for a Quaker patron cultivated by the school's founder, Richard Henry Pratt. And we can see the 2 of them here. This is Susan Longstreth up here, and this is a portrait of Richard Henry Pratt. So this actually is an older image published in the 1912 catalog. And so it predates Marie's matriculation by a few months. But the caption reads, excuse me, this society, bearing the name of one of the first and most honored friends of the school, has existed for more than 10 years, including as it does the best character and talent from some 300 girls, with a comfortable and tastefully decorated room for its meetings. It is an influence for good, mentally and morally, which cannot well be measured. All the societies emulate each other in furnishing the school most pleasing entertainment. So the thing to know here is that there were 2 boys or men's societies and 2 for women, and they competed against one another. Marie's exuberant personality and budding literary skills are evident in samples of her writing that are featured in the senior edition of the Carlisle Arrow, where the talents of the graduating class took center stage. And I have to say that I found the continuity of voice and personality between these years and her later writings and activities kind of astonishing, especially since I've recently come into possession of some of my own childhood letters, which I read and think, you know, who is that person? For Marie, there was this incredible set of interests and passions that she just maintained her entire life, sometimes against all odds. So this essay documents Marie's early passion for travel. It leaves no doubt that she had developed a taste for urbanity and the energy of the city during her Pennsylvania sojourn. The excursion that she chronicles here occurred in late February when she traveled to Philadelphia with her YWCA group, ostensibly to see Billy Sunday, the popular baseball player turned evangelist, preach. The sense of exhilaration conveyed in her opening paragraph animates the entire essay. She writes, I had just given up all hope of ever seeing Philadelphia again when one day, after our YWCA meeting, the advisory member came up to me and asked if I would not like to hear Billy Sunday. Of course, I would not let such a chance go by. And although the time set for going was 3 weeks off, I immediately began preparing for the trip. After 3 weeks of delightful anticipation, the day arrived and 12 eager girls were up and ready to go long before it was time. After we were actually on the way, it seemed to us excited girls that we could get on faster if we should get out and push the train, although it would have been easier to walk than to push. She gives due space to the revivalist encampment or tabernacle and to Billy Sunday's sermon, but what really comes through is how enraptured she was with being in the city, shopping at Wanamaker's department store, standing on the rooftop from which she could survey the magnificent cityscape and see all the way to Camden, New Jersey. They toured Betsy Ross's home on their final day, but first they visited the University of Pennsylvania Museum. She explains that the buildings were, quote, very beautiful with ivy climbing over the walls. but one of them left a lasting impression. In the museum, we found the Indian relics of most interest to us, but some of us were disappointed to find that we were not represented there. Pardon me, get a drink of water. My allergies are terrible. This is one of the things about living in Sacramento where we have so much pollen. So another sample of her prose is also published in this same edition, and it's inspired by the poetry of James Whitcomb Riley, and she also riffs on a Bible verse here from the book of Acts. And it foreshadows, this particular writing, I feel, foreshadows the spirit of generosity and intellectual curiosity that she exhibited throughout her adult life, and especially in her activist years. And since I have this published in full in the book, I won't read all of it here, but you can see that she's talking about what has she, to give her people when she goes back, and to give herself, and how she feels like she says, what have I to give myself? If I am good and kind to others, they will be the same to me. If I help them, they will in turn want to help me. If I have given to them the best I had, they will want to give to me of the best they have. If I have taught them anything, they will want to teach me of what they know. Silver and gold have I none, but such as I have, I give unto thee. What have I to give the world? Again, another quote, give to the world the best you have, and it will come back to you. And indeed, she does this. So this is a list of the graduating class that I transcribed from the March 1915 Arrow. And notice, Maria's number 13 here, the tribal affiliation beside her name. This was disparaging terminology applied to many California Native nations, and Marie knew this was not the name of her people. And although she had read and written it on government forms her entire life, in her last months at Carlisle, she must have appealed to the senior teacher, Emma Foster. I say this because Foster pinned verses honoring each of the graduates that were published as a poem in the senior edition. And the verse that she wrote for Marie, I used for the epigraph for this chapter, which reads, "From far off Pacific, the famed Golden Gate, comes Marie, Amidam, the pride of her state." So we see by the end of her time at Carlisle that she's starting to exert herself a little bit in terms of standing up for herself. And here are the graduates posing in front of that bandstand that I showed earlier. And the women, by the way, also their own commencement dresses. You can see this banner that reads "Class Fidelity." It was one of the few artifacts that Marie encountered in the school museum in 1953 when she returned to campus. By then, it had reverted to the Army War College. Declaring that she had spent some of her happiest years there, she stopped by with her friend Bertha Stewart when they were wending their way home on a long trip from Washington, D.C., after testifying at a Senate subcommittee. And here is, yes, she's numbered here. Carlisle maintained records on all its alumni, and most left without earning degrees, but Marie was an exception. She earned both an academic degree and 2 vocational certificates. After the commencement ceremonies were over, she spent about a month with her cousin Eli, the one who had come after her when she was 4 years old and took off from that bath that terrified her. So by now, Eli is married and living in Philadelphia in a suburb where he works for a wealthy capitalist named William Potts. No relation. I searched long and hard to be sure of that. And Eli is working for him as a driver and a car mechanic. And he had preceded her at Carlisle, graduating in 1907. So she stays with him for a while, and I think is likely employed by William Potts during this time. But then in July 1915, she boards the train for California and the Greenville Indian Industrial School. So back to the school. Here she reconnected with her old flame Hensley Potts, shown here with members of the Machukta Indian band who entertained in nearby Chico. The two were married before the year was out. The notice was published in the January 16th Carlisle Arrow, as was typical of the newspapers that circulated between the boarding schools. They like to report on these things that fit their assimilationist script. So you can kind of hear some of that in the passage, which reads, Mr. Edgar K. Miller, superintendent at Greenville, California, sends in the following item to Mr. Lips, who was the superintendent at Carlisle at that time. I wish to report to you the marriage of Miss Marie Mason, which took place at this agency December 30th by the Reverend Reeder, missionary here. She married Mr. Hensley Potts, one of the progressive young Indians in this jurisdiction. He has steady work at Ingalls Mine and seems to be industrious. He earns $3 a day. Marie is one of our 1950 graduates, and her many friends at Carlisle wish her and her husband a long and happy life. So these two had known each other for a long time. They had a romance going before Marie ever left for Carlisle. And you can see Hensley here playing the fiddle in the Greenville School band. And he passed on his musical talent and interest to his daughters, who were all musicians and in the schools where they also were boarding students. And Hensley was known throughout this region as being a really good fiddler. Even though he's playing drums for the Mechoopda Indian band, he was a good fiddler. So the couple settled down in Marie's Mountain Maidu homeland, southeast of Mount Lassen, where she gives birth to 6 children. Their only son died at 1 year old, literally on the eve of his sister's birth. After the copper mining boom subsided, they moved from Ingalls to Greenville, where Marie's mother lived. And then after her death in 1926, they moved up to Chester and Prattville. Here, resorts were developing around Lake Almanor, a hydroelectric reservoir created when Marie's birthplace, Big Meadow, was dammed and flooded. You may remember that she took the Western Pacific out to Carlisle. The railroad had just inaugurated the scenic Feather River route, carrying Bay Area residents to Marie's ancestral territory, which was now dotted with prime hunting and fishing resorts. Hensley worked during this time as an Indian hunting and fishing guide, and Marie helped him, but she also worked as a resort housekeeper and seamstress. By 1930, the couple had separated. And in 1942, Marie moved to Sacramento, where several of her adult daughters had settled after they graduated from Sherman in Southern California. During her marriage, opportunities to deploy the organizational and writing skills she had honed at Carlisle were in very short supply, much to her own disappointment, but this was about to change. So in 1947, Marie became involved with the newly formed Federated Indians of California, an organization that fueled her activist career for the next 3 decades. I'm sure some of you know that 18 treaties were negotiated with various California Indian groups following statehood, and they were then rejected by the US Senate under pressure from the California legislature. So the legislation I have there in the middle, 1928 California Indians Jurisdictional Act, was passed, which allowed, by special legislation, and allowed suit to be brought in the US Court of Claims for the promised treaty, the value of the promised treaty lands, goods, and services. There was never any land back going on here. The court's findings were handed down eventually in 1944 in favor of California Indians, but the award was pathetic because the federal government had assured, when the legislation was passed, had ensured that they could deduct any expenses that they had spent toward California Indian people in the interim. So the 1946 Indian Claims Commission Act, federal piece of legislation, offered another chance to achieve justice. This legislation would allow California Indians to sue for the rest of their ancestral territory. So basically the entire state of California, minus the treaty lands and rancheria and reservation territory. Federated Indians, a coalition of landless and reservation-based Indians, formed to bring before the commission what they hoped would be a unified suit on behalf of all California Indians. And the group was led by a Central Sierra Miwok man named William Fuller and a Tolowa woman named Bertha Stewart. Potts joined their ranks in January 1947 at a Sacramento meeting, and she quickly became their most visible and productive member. This is the newspaper Potts published out of her home for 3 decades. Her youngest daughter, Kitty, was its inaugural editor, but Potts's imprint is on it from the get-go. 3 Potts women were sharing this house at 2727 Santa Clara Way. And it became the FIC's headquarters and obviously publishing house. So family labor was a pool. Her family was a labor pool for this pioneering publication from the start. The smoke signal was more than a vehicle to disseminate news about land claims, although in its earliest months, that was certainly a primary message, in part because there were other land claims groups that were forming, and they were led by white men, and the FIC was just certain that they were crooked. So when Potts takes over the role of smoke signal editor 13 months into the newspaper's life, her vision for a much more expansive voice for all California Indian people and issues began to take root, clearly watered by her exposure to Carlisle's print and reading culture, as I demonstrate in the book. The Susans, clearly had an influence. Trying to get my cursor to work. So I also spent some time talking about Potts's editorial alter ego, a figure she named Injun Louis. And he makes his appearance in single frame cartoons during the newspaper's first year. Marie's intelligence and creativity is evident in the way she deploys this masculine, befuddled, functionally illiterate character as an emblem of white society's take on Native people. And she uses him to prod politically ambivalent Indians into stepping up to the political plate and to voice really biting critiques of the federal government that showed who the real savage was. Injun Louis also made his way into mailboxes across the state and country when it was time for smoke signal subscribers to renew. His use of Hollywood Indian English and antics were just one vein of the abundant humor that coursed through the smoke signal pages. While Injun Louis was never shy about speaking his mind, the same cannot be said of Potts, who maintained a pretty modest editorial presence at first. On rare occasions, she might use her initials, as we see here. But more often she referred to herself in third person plural as the staff. Visits from FIC treasurer Bertha Stewart, who lived and worked in San Francisco, were clear highlights of newspaper production parties. Later, these included her grandchildren and any other visitors that happened to come into the house. They typed stencils, cranked the mimeograph machine, collated, stapled, folded, and stamped the newspaper for distribution far and wide, even to servicemen and women in Korea during the war. And Potts also took a lot of pleasure in the paper's growing popularity with subscribers. So she writes here in this little piece she reproduces in the newspaper, many nice letters have come with renewals that gives one the satisfaction that all is not in vain. Here's a sample, and then she quotes from one of the letters. Here's $1 to keep the smoke signal coming my way. Great little paper. I guess so I look forward to its arrival. I go out on my front porch and gaze Sacramento way to see if the smoke is rolling up. Marie also used the smoke signal to cultivate California Indian diaspora, encouraging conversations across tribal, linguistic, and generational divides. Here she asks, can you top this? What's the name of that thing has been the question heard from every direction in all walks of life. The object is the baby basket that Indian mothers carry their babies in strapped on their backs. Every tribe have their own name for this basket. The Maidu call it tutu, translation meaning nest. The Miwok name is hiki, I like in it. With every tribe is a different name. The common name has been baby basket or baby cradle. I have heard it called papoose caboose. What's your name for it? Oops, now I gotta figure out how to get that off of there. There we go. So in 1950, Marie inaugurated a tradition she would continue for 2.5 decades, installing an exhibit at the California State Fair. This was revolutionary work because it entailed a native versus a white person interpreting California Indian culture. And here I'd like to remind you of that 1915 essay about her trip to Philadelphia, where she laments not finding Maidu people in the University of Pennsylvania Museum exhibits. For 2 weeks every year, her exhibit booth became a meeting place for California Indian people from across the state, as well as a site of cross-cultural encounter where demonstrations of dance and acorn preparation and weaving were popular attractions for native and non-native fairgoers. I devote an entire chapter to her curatorial ambitions and accomplishments because they were so historically significant. And I wanted also to tell the story of her own awakening to the dispossession of material culture and related traditions like basket weaving and regalia making that had taken place over the course of the last century as private collectors, anthropologists, and museum curators scoured the state for objects. Bereft of their lands and ability to make a living in traditional ways, forced into a kind of peonage by the time Marie is born, few families had been able to hold on to the skills and material inheritances of their ancestors. It was during this time that Potts was forced to confront the limitations of her boarding school education. In pursuit of one kind of knowledge, she had missed out on the possibilities of another. As a museum anthropologist, this was both an exciting and a tough chapter to write. It brought me to a new and uneasy level of consciousness. Inhabiting and interpreting the archive of her life up to this point had been listening to and observing her experiences as a boarding school student and a young mother subject to racism, marital strife, loss of children, and homelands. But her curatorial work took me to a different place, an ethnographic field site with which I was both intimately familiar and, as it turns out, not so familiar. It was turf I had occupied for much of my own career, with unfettered access to reservoirs of art and material culture from around the world. But now these tables were turned, and I was learning from Marie what it was like to discover that one's own community was virtually stripped of its art and heirlooms. Encountering that painful void through the affective lens of a Native woman for whom I developed a tremendous amount of respect, offered a profound and painful insight, as ethnographic field work is sometimes wont to do. So after the 1950 State Fair, Marie was invited to co-found the Sacramento Anthropological Society. Back up. Yeah, sorry. Where she held board member status. At the time, Sacramento had no professionally trained anthropologists, but through this organization, she met some budding Berkeley professionals, one of whom would later employ her as a cultural demonstrator at the State Indian Museum in Sacramento. He would also introduce her to Sam Barrett, Alfred Kroeber's first doctoral graduate. This is Barrett here. Recently retired from the Milwaukee Public Museum, he was working on a series of documentaries called the American Indian Film Project, in which he casts Marie and some of her grandchildren. I document these activities and connections, but I also interrogate some thornier issues in this chapter. I show how stumped anthropologists were by the very concept of a literate California native, one who could and did read from the huge corpus of salvage ethnography produced during the prior century. I explore Marie's relationship with anthropologists and cultural consulting at a time when land claims were being adjudicated based not on contemporary Native people's testimony and knowledge of their ancestors, but on anthropological works. And I also tease out some of Marie's motivations for engaging in the discipline. Marie joined the National Congress of American Indians, or NCAI, in 1954. She was a faithful volunteer and developed a close relationship with its executive director, Helen Peterson, who welcomed Potts into new activist circles like the 1961 American Indian Chicago Conference, for which Potts served as a steering committee member and a California delegate. And during the lead up to this conference, Peterson invited Potts to come to DC and the NCAI offices, where she took on a variety of tasks, including the role of guest editor for NCAI's May 1961 bulletin. Her column about the goals of the American Indian Chicago Conference continues to be one of the most cited of her written works, pinned as it was in the midst of federal efforts to terminate tribes. And I have a little call out that shows why this writing continues to resonate today. She writes, the Indians' view of the land is different from that of the non-Indian. Indians feel a social relationship to the land, while the non-Indian regards the land in commercial terms. Indians are concerned about the development of their human and natural resources and cannot see why people must be dispossessed of their land or other natural resources to help get them on their feet. Potts' 1961 sojourn in Washington and Chicago bolstered her understanding of the collective oppression Native people suffered from colonization. And before long, the smoke signal began to reflect this understanding. This particular passage highlights the contemporary legacies of land dispossession in boarding schools. She writes, baskets were a necessity for some Indian tribes a few years ago. Today, they're collector's items or museum pieces. Although there's a great demand for baskets, there are very few basket weavers today. The slump in basket weaving became apparent when young people were carted off to boarding schools. Weaving was taught in the home as soon as children were able to handle the tools, and unless you continue to work at it day after day, the technique is soon lost. At the boarding schools, students were taught other methods of earning a living that were less time-consuming than basket weaving. We are trying to pick up the threads now, but find it very difficult to find materials with so much of the land occupied as private property, public parks, national forests, and huge construction projects, destroying so much of the materials. A few weavers take orders and demand some down payment because the customer will not accept the item when it is finished. They yell too much. The weaver only averages a few cents an hour for her work. So Potts continues to critique mainstream society's ills and stereotypes about Native Americans in brief editorials, and her placement of these just below the masthead on the prime real estate of the newspaper shows how far she had come in developing her cultural and editorial authority. Clockwise here are samples of her commentary on Thanksgiving, on social and economic strife, privatization of land and other natural resources, and last but not least, the bicentennial as a celebration of genocide against Native people. By the late 1960s, the Native press and a generation of professionally trained Native journalists was on the rise. And in 1970, a new organization called the American Indian Press Association began to take shape, thanks to a young Oglala Lakota man who passed away just a couple years ago, last year, in fact, I think, Chuck Trimble, who is standing on the in the back on the left here. Potts by now was legendary. The images here, including the one on the upper right of Vine Deloria Jr., who was then editor of Indian World Today, are from the 1972 AIPA conference. The fledgling organization met in Denver that year, and Potts, a co-founding board member, was surprised and honored with the creation of an award in her name, and you can see her holding it here. The Denver Indian Center hosted the conference banquet, and it was here that Marie presented the inaugural award and a check. You can see that right here. A check for $500, about $3,000 in today's money, to Akwesasne Notes. And that's Jerry Gamble, the managing editor in the middle there, who accepted the award on behalf of the paper. In 1977, Potts' own book was published by Naturegraph Press, a small publishing house in Happy Camp, California. Written in accessible prose designed to reach and teach school children and the lay public, it was based in large part upon a booklet she penned in 1970, A Brief History of Indians of California. The cover featured a photograph with her grandchildren, Susie, Joe, and Judy Marine, posing at the site of the Honey Run covered bridge, recently destroyed in a fire, the campfire, I believe. So notice her pen name, which translates as Indian woman, and the dedication at the bottom to her 3 daughters who had taken the never to look back journey. In chapter 10, which I titled Being California Indian in the City, I connect these 2 publications to her many years of guest lecturing in Sacramento area schools, work that she, that was documented for posterity in this film, Chinkut Pen, which means sharp eyes. It is the nickname that her grandmother gave her, and that's one of the school children's drawings in anticipation of her arrival at Arco Elementary School in Galt. She always took along acorn soup for students to sample. She let them try on her basket caps and burden baskets, and taught them a few Maidu words. It was clearly work that she treasured. And I have to thank the filmmaker, Jerry Heine, and the school teacher, Robin Swift, and Mike Weber, who got the funding for this film, because it's a wonderful first-person narrative. And this is my last slide. Potts died on June 24th, 1978, in the town of Susanville, where she had worked to pay her train fare out to Carlisle. She had suffered a stroke several years earlier and was confined to a wheelchair, but had insisted on going to the bear dance, a Mountain Maidu spring ceremony hosted by her friend Gladys Menkins at her ranch in nearby Janesville. Her obituary, both the longer and the short versions that I show here, was carried in the native and mainstream press all the way through Canada and across the US. And all these obituaries pay tribute to her long and lettered life. Thank you.
That was, I'm back, and that was so incredible. I took a bunch of notes, which I do very often for these lectures, but I have so many questions, and we're almost at the top of the hour. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and then I'm going to take some from the Q&A and the chat from the audience.
Okay.
But I'm first going to say that was such a wonderful portrait. It's so quick. I know there's so much more to know, and I'm sure it's all in the book. A couple people have asked, and I've put it up in the chat for those of you who are interested. I already put in the chat the title of the book, Terri's book, and where you can get it, because there's so much more to know, and you've covered so much in 50 minutes. That was really incredible, because it was really a great portrait of a wonderful person, incredibly ambitious. She had a lot of fire. That you mentioned her exuberant personality, and somebody who also became super successful at like everything she did, her family life and keeping her family together, and publishing and writing, and her activism and organizing. And this was really a nice way to for the book club to cap off its month-long programming centered around celebrating women's history. So I really appreciate you coming to talk about Marie Potts with us. She's someone I didn't really know anything about until I started researching her and you to come do a talk for us. So thank you for sharing an incredible and powerful person with us.
Thank you for having me.
I hope you'll come back and talk more about her and some of your work. I wanted to ask a little bit about how long you have been working on this, how long you worked on this book. And clearly you're still working on Marie Potts. So tell us a little bit about your journey and what got you interested in researching her and writing a book in the first place.
Well, Marie Potts was actually a cultural consultant to anthropologists in my department. So the man who was chair when I was hired, Jerry Johnson, had fond memories of her at the state fair when he was a graduate student or maybe an undergraduate student. And a lot of people, native and non-native, knew Marie. But working with her, in terms of how long I've been working, I started organizing some of her material in the late 90s. And I was really taken with her intelligence. And because she had done these state fair exhibits, I was sort of drawn to that piece. It was something I could do. And as I said in the acknowledgements, I was never going to go near all of the complicated land claims issues, but I had to eventually. And I never actually intended to write a book until a granddaughter began asking when I was going to get that book done. So I started then, just, maybe that was 2012, 2014. I started thinking, oh, I guess I should, in fact, think about publishing all this material. I had published articles, I'd given a lot of papers, but her life is just so rich. And she lived till she was 83 and just got all, she was just all over the place. So I was trying to piece her life together and traveling around to all these different archives and getting to know her family that had also gone out to Carlisle through archival sources, and basically trying to put together an ethnographic portrait of her that would do her justice. As you said, she was involved in so many things, but she did all of this on a shoestring. And I just have so much admiration for her. And I hope a lot of other people take up Marie's life as well. The people who knew her, I hope will write about her, because of course, we all know individuals. We have relationships with them, and they're different than their public persona and so forth. So, there's
as part of the book, did you actually interview people, talk to some people who knew her, even your colleagues?
Yes. And in fact, the filmmaker that I referred to was working in my department as a instructional technician. And so I remember going into our lab, onto a part of the lab that I usually didn't enter into. It wasn't my area. And he showed me this, I don't know, was it 8 or 16 millimeter film? And it was the first time I heard her voice. And it was just so amazing to hear her on tape. And honestly, I was looking for some photographs to use in this presentation. And I found all kinds of more stuff that's been digitized. And that's out there. So there's just a lot of richness in 20th century California Native history that is just starting to be documented and written about. And one thing I hope this book does is help archivists know that there's value in this material, and how to think about how to catalog it or process it, because a lot of it's very humble looking material. It's like a mimeograph.
Unassuming. Yeah, very unassuming. And you shared some great photos and images and illustrations that are just like, wow, like I can't believe you found that, and that still exists. The paper, for example, there's some questions about the paper. And I don't know if you know the details on like how was it circulated, and did people subscribe to it, and how was it distributed, all of that kind of stuff.
So the paper initially was published for free, in part because, and not sent for free, but there was no subscription fee. And the reason for that was the earlier land claims, the 1928 land claims, had been fraught with a lot of politics around money. There were other activists that did I'm talking about white people here, that had done some good things, but had also done some bad things. And the FIC felt like they needed to be very transparent and to not charge money for information about land claims, because there were fraudulent claims being made and money being collected from Native people based on the idea that they would never be able to benefit from the award, a monetary award, if they weren't signed up with one or another organization, which wasn't true at all. So they were they were initially free, but after about a year, it became really evident that the organization wouldn't be able to send delegates to Washington, D.C., wouldn't be able to fund that, and also fund the newspaper unless they started charging for the paper. So then it became $1. And I think it went to $2 maybe in the 60s. And then by the 1970s, maybe $3. And it was taken by, it was subscribed to by museums and university libraries all over the country. And again, in Canada, especially after.
How often was it published? I think, did you say?
So, it wasn't a regular periodical. And in fact, she takes people to task sometimes who are like, where's my paper? Because they wanted it on a monthly basis. And she just.
Consistent, yeah.
Right. And many times she was just doing all this work, especially by the time she became active on the national stage. It was really tough to get the work done. And I know her grandchildren contributed a lot of labor to getting the newspaper put out. So, it for the most part, it was monthly originally, and then probably, I'm trying to think, quarterly at some point. And during the period when she was working with Sam Barrett on the American Indian Film Project and going off to Chicago and Washington, it was missed. It might come out every 3 months. And she took people to task when they kind of like, where's my paper? Because she was doing it all for free, literally by this time for free. So, and they originally stamped, like got postage stamps and placed them on the newspaper. And then after a while, they got whatever those meters are called. I can't remember that, that we use for bulk mail now.
So did she drew the cartoons in there herself? I
have to say, I'm pretty sure that it was her daughter, Kitty, and her husband at the time, Kesner's original drawing. They were both Sherman students. But Marie, clearly, Kitty died in 1951. So Marie continued the tradition of Injun Louis. And I think he's one of the coolest things about the newspaper was, he's just, because she sort of, it's a patriarchal time. And even in the native world, of course, because that's part of what assimilation does. And so she's kind of, I don't want to say hides behind him, but she uses him to do this really difficult work so that she can keep this sort of more diplomatic persona in the newspaper. She's a really bright woman.
Yeah. She made it her own and used it the way she needed to use it. That's brilliant. That's a brilliant move. Let's just say that's a brilliant move. So someone asks.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. And
just very biting. So she had this one voice that she used with the school children and so forth, but she could really, set you back a little bit with some of her writing and so forth.
Yeah, well, she had to. She was doing important work. She couldn't.
I have to give it to her.
Yeah.
She was a political animal. I think that's the thing that is really important to understand about her, is that she was interested in cultural material and revival and so forth. But at heart, she was about activism. She was about justice and equity, and she liked to go to the Capitol. She liked to pick up the bills from the bill room at the legislature and all those sorts of things. She never missed a beat.
So let's see. Let's ask a couple of these questions because we're just about 5 minutes after 6 o'clock. There's someone who says, Marie's comics remind me of L. Frank's single image coyote cartoons featured in news from native California beginning in the 1990s. Are you aware of any other California Indian women cartoonists active?
Yeah, I am not. I am familiar with that art and those cartoons, which are, they're just magnificent. And, we need more of it. We need more of that, because humor can go places that other kinds of political discourse can't. So I find a lot of L. Frank's work really inspiring and also wonderfully artistic. I love art.
And so here's a question. It says your book seems to be based principally on historic texts, but can you please speak a bit about the material objects that seem to be significant in the development of her voice?
So when she began to put this inaugural, what she called All California Indian exhibit, named all because she didn't want any California Indian people to find that they were not represented, right? And she had not been represented at the University of Pennsylvania Museum. When she began to put that together, she naively thought that she would be able to go to communities and reach out to Native people and get objects and have them loaned to her. And eventually she did, but it was a lot of work, and she had to get insurance, and she had to convince people that the material would be safe under the state fair security. And when she went, she was about to cancel the space, and she went up to her home territory, which she had lived in. I don't, obviously had to leave a lot out of this talk, but when she lived back in her own homelands, she was obviously in touch with the other Native people there, Maidu, Paiute, Washoe, and so forth. But there were a couple families that were still very much carrying on the tradition of basket weaving. And some did loan material to her. But when she encountered this material and kind of realized what it represented, which was a quality of material that basically had been stripped by museums and anthropologists from the local habitat. When I say stripped, people who are like, oh no, we paid for it. There's that kind of discourse. But the fact is, Native people had to take care of themselves, and they had to take care of children. And sometimes they didn't think their regalia would ever be used again. And so it's a complex process, right? The dispossession of Native people of their objects. And so when she finally managed to get some of this material, she was just in awe of it. And she took up weaving again herself. She had started a basket when she was living with her mother. And she lived with her mom for a few years, and after she came home, and before her mom died in 1926. So she took up her weaving again. And in fact, when Jerry Brown had an exhibit of Native American objects at the state capitol in, it was 1971. I should know that date, but I don't. She exhibited the baby basket that she made at 3 years old. In other words, I don't mean baby basket, but a little basket she had made when she was a really young little girl. And it had been given to another family, but the family by that time, like other Maidu families, was recognizing that they wanted to carry the tradition on. And so they had traditionally burned baskets with the deceased, but they were starting to retain them. And so there was just this sort of welling up of sentiment in her, and therefore in me too, around the recovery of these traditions, which had not died in some families, but had been sort of forsaken. It takes a lot of time to gather weaving materials and to tend the plants and to prep it. And as she said in that one editorial, the financial side of it wasn't really lucrative for Native people at that time.
Right. Yeah. So a couple more questions, then we will wrap up. So this is a great question. Did the strength of Potts's voice and her personality make easier work as an ethnographer in the archives?
It did indeed. I mean, first of all, it's nice to like and kind of relate a little bit to your subject. Again, because I had spent so much time in museums, I was really drawn to that part of her work. I was just like, wow, here's this brilliant Native woman in 1950 doing things that we don't have enough Native women doing now. And so, yeah, I was really drawn to that. And yes, she had a very strong voice, and she was very politically strategic. You know, she could write a letter to this senator that was very sort of almost patronizing, and then she could write a letter on the same topic to another Native person and kind of like, you know, shred things. And so she was a fascinating figure, and also just really intellectually curious. And you know, some of the professors who knew her in my department have told me that she was just really outgoing, and she would always wanted to be along for whatever ride was happening. So I think it did make it really interesting. It also took me a long time to write the book, because I just wanted to make sure I really understood her, and that I understood the motivations for going out to Carlisle, which were not purely that she had been totally brainwashed. You know, there was certainly, that's what the boarding schools did, but there was also the motivation to go where her cousin was, and to travel and see the world. And, you know, not everybody wants to stay home.
Yeah, it was probably a very complicated and, you know, difficult thing to do, right? And
yes,
and
yeah, scary
in many ways, and scary. Yeah,
but she had an element of fearlessness that really comes through. I mean, I don't have any of that fearlessness, but she did.
A bravery that is incredible, right? In every aspect of her work. Someone asks, let me find the question really quick. And this kind of speaks to the legacy question, like what is, you know, her legacy? Have any of her grandchildren continued with similar activist work, or what are they up to?
Yes. So her grandchildren by Pansy, which was one of the daughters who helped with the smoke signal, helped quite a bit, and was like the secretary of the organization for a while. They have carried on traditional dance. They've participated, for instance, in the Maidu Dancers and Traditionalists, which is a dance group that Frank Lapina was the captain of for a while. I don't know if everybody knows who Frank Lapina is, but he was a professor of art and ethnic studies in my department until quite recently, when he passed. But he was a Wintu man who got very interested in and came up during the period when ethnic studies was just starting to happen. And the American Indian Historical Society was organized by Rupert Costa in San Francisco. And so Frank was kind of part of that organization. So there's a real genealogy of Native people who we can tie back to some of Marie's work and continue on into her grandchildren. By the grandchildren that you saw in that one slide that was the cover of the book that she used, those children continue to dance and so forth.
And bring forth her legacy.
Yes, you know? and also there are just a lot of Native women in the Sacramento and greater Sacramento region who knew Marie, and she babysat some of them and so forth. But they also, you know, I mean, at the different, you know, like Wilton Rancheria, Auburn, Ione, they're still a living memory of her for a lot of Native people in this area. So I'm hoping a lot of them will take up the task of fleshing out even more parts of her life and other Native women's lives. California.
Yeah, I'm sure there are other, you know, others like her who were equally as impactful in all areas of her work. I mean, she was an activist, a writer, a publisher. I mean, there are others.
Everyone knows Mabel McKay, but a lot of people knew Marie, and so we have these deficits in California Native history that relate to women in the 20th century. And fortunately, there's a lot of Native California female scholars taking up the banner. So that's kind of exciting to see at this period in my career, to see that they're starting to claim this job of writing their histories.
Yeah. So one of the last messages in the chat, it says, I think starting alone at 5 years old must have contributed to her courage, curiosity, and growth.
Yeah.
Amazing woman.
Yeah.
It's an amazing story. And good.
And she turned 5 while she was at school. She was taken there when she was 4.
Yeah, that's,
that's
thank you for sharing this incredible woman with us. I'm going to get a copy of the book. I hope you'll sign it for me. If I write a nice little note to you, asking you to sign it for me, because it's an incredible story, a powerful person, and there's lots that we didn't get to tonight in this talk. So I look forward to seeing it in the book itself. And I'm going to be sharing.
I just want to say,
I'm going to be sharing with everybody. We're talking on top of each other again. So I'm just going to say my thing, and then I'll let you say your thing. I'm going to share with everybody tomorrow in the email that I send out to participants information about you, more information about how to contact you, but also about how to purchase the book if people are interested in doing that. So, Terri, your turn now.
So I just wanted to say that the royalties from this book go to an endowment that I have established in her name at Sac State that is going to help fund research on 20th century Native California history. That's all. And thank you for having me.
Well, I'm glad you said that. Now you have to buy the book. Right now I have to get it because that's important too. Thank you, Terri, so much for being our speaker tonight. This was terrific. I want to thank everybody for attending this Book Club of California program. I hope you will join us for our next online program. It's titled Documenting and Preserving Humanity's Cultural Legacy. And that's going to be on Monday, April 12th, not next Monday, 2 Mondays from now, 5 to 6:15 p.m. here on Zoom. This is going to be another live online presentation by Carla Schroer, the co-founder and director of the Cultural Heritage Institute. You can register for this event online at bccbooks.org/programs or using the link that's in your weekly programs emails that you may be receiving from the book club. So my final quote, I like to do this. Give to the world the best you have and it will come back to you. That is a quote from tonight's presentation by Marie Mason Potts. So take that with you, give to the world the best you have, and it will come back to you, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful evening, be well, and take care of yourself. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, Terri.
Bye.